How do juries deliberate? Once the jury is inside the deliberation room, the process begins. The figure here on the slide illustrates the various stages of deliberation. There are a number of psychological factors that play a role in the decisions they make at each stage. Just think back to all the topics we've covered so far in this class. Social identity, social perception, social categorization, which includes stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Attitude formation, social influence, group dynamics, helping behavior, and aggressive behavior. Any one of these concepts could play a role in who is selected as foreperson, in how the group members discuss the evidence, and in how they vote. For now, let's focus on the various steps involved in this process. One of the first tasks is to select a foreperson or representative for the jury and set an agenda. Then, the members discuss the instructions, evidence, and arguments. After some time, they vote. If they reach the necessary consensus, which varies from courthouse to courthouse, their job is done, and they return the verdict to the judge, who will have it read in open court for the record. If they don't reach a consensus, the question becomes whether the group is making progress toward a decision. If not, the judge will declare what is called a hung jury. This means they could not decide whether to acquit or convict using the instructions provided by the judge. If progress is being made, the jury returns to the previous step of discussing the evidence, arguments, and instructions from the judge. Eventually, the group will make a decision and return a verdict, or they'll stop making progress and the judge will declare a hung jury. Now that you're more familiar with the deliberation process, let's take a look at how juries select a foreperson. This individual serves as the moderator of the group, not the leader, but the person who facilitates the discussion and keeps the group on track. In theory, the members of a jury are created equal. They come from a random pool of citizens, but juries exist in a social context. It's possible that most, if not all, of the topics you've learned about in this course operate within these groups. For example, in decision-making groups, including juries, a handful of people will probably dominate the discussion, while most people will join in at a lower rate or simply watch from the sidelines. From a statistical standpoint, juries tend to select forepersons who have one or more of the following qualities. 1. Their job or occupation is one of high status or prestige, like a doctor or a CEO. 2. They've served on a jury before and have prior experience with the process. 3. They were the first person to speak in the deliberation room. Or 4. They were seated at the head of the rectangular table. If you're selected to serve on a jury and you want to be the foreperson, sit where everyone can see you. Introduce yourself first and tell everyone your occupation. And if you happen to have jury experience, don't forget to mention that too. Chances are, you'll be nominated to be the foreperson because the rest of the group sees you as a good fit for the role. Now let's look at how social psychology applies to the jury's decision to convict or acquit. First, jurors use both types of influence, informational and normative, to resolve disagreements and try to convince others of their perspective. Sometimes the jury will be divided into a large majority versus a small minority. Peer pressure, for example, plays a role in convincing these few people to change their minds. Other times, the jury is split more evenly with nearly equal-sized subgroups. Sometimes, the minority can convince the majority to change its mind, as depicted in the movie 12 Angry Men. Second, if we know how individual members vote the first time, we can often predict the final verdict. In one particular study by Calvin and Zeisel, they examined 215 jury decisions, comparing the group's first vote to their final vote. 209 of these juries, about 97%, reached a final verdict that was consistent with their first vote. In other words, the majority tends to rule when it comes to jury deliberations. However, when the initial vote is split, deliberation tends to lead to acquittal. Take a look at Table 12.7 on the slide. This illustrates the leniency bias, the tendency for jury deliberations to produce an acquittal. Social psychologists believe it's probably easier to raise a reasonable doubt than it is to erase any and all doubt. Now let's examine the impact of size on deliberations. One of the reasons social psychologists study this relationship is because municipalities vary in the typical size of their juries and whether the verdict has to be unanimous or the majority. Further, the threshold for what constitutes the majority also varies. Generally speaking, in small juries of 6 members, there are fewer allies to align with, and therefore it's more difficult for individuals to resist normative pressures. It's important to note that small juries are less representative of minority groups. In addition, small juries tend to spend less time discussing the evidence and the arguments than large groups. Many of us are familiar with unanimous verdicts. These are often depicted on television and in movies. However, some municipalities do not require all members to be in agreement. Instead, they implement some form of majority rules. Social psychologists have examined these juries and found that minority groups have even less power, in part because the majority is not required to convince all of the minority. Their opinion doesn't hold as much weight. Also, these juries spend less time deliberating and tend to be less confident about the verdict than juries that require a unanimous decision. As you can see from this slide, the justice system in the U.S. is not perfect. Because humans are involved, it's susceptible to bias and errors. In the final video of this lecture, we'll consider whether justice is served by this system and how it differs from those of other cultures.